What do you think of the present strike by the Advisory Council? They seem to be labouring under a very strong sense of grievance.
Well, what the council sought were far-reaching powers extending to the Royal Commission Act. In fact, they were one of their resolutions asked for the powers to hold inquiries into anything relating to the ACT, giving them the Royal Commission powers that call witnesses from any part of Australia. Now, these sort of powers just can't be handed over broadly and easily unless the like responsibilities that go with those sort of powers are handed over as well. I'm sorry for the Advisory Council if they read into my rejection of these requests for power as a rejection of self-government, because this is not so. There was no mention of self-government in my letter to the Advisory Council at all.
Do you intend to meet the Advisory Council to explain all this?
Well, not at this stage. I understand they've written to me. The letter's been published in the paper, but in point of fact the letter has never reached me officially yet from the Advisory Council. They've dealt with it in another fashion. But what I will do is I'll read their letter with a great deal of interest to see if there are any points that they've made upon which I can meet them, and then having studied the letter, I'll be in a position to know where I go from there as far as the Advisory Council are concerned.
We can't limit our horizons always.
Federal Minister for the Interior, Mr Nixon.
I think history will show that people will be attracted to it. I certainly don't think Captain Cook would object. I think he in fact would be pleased that in Canberra we're trying to make some attempt to perpetuate his memory.
Now, the jet is costing $320,000, I believe, and there has been considerable criticism. In fact, I think it has been described in the papers as Nixon's folly. Do you think that this is an extravagance?
It's expensive, certainly, but to describe it as, anything that's beautiful is very often described as being extravagant. No, I don't think it's an extravagance. I think it's something that'll last for many, many years. I think it's something that a great number of people, both in Canberra and visiting Canberra, will enjoy. I certainly don't think it's an extravagance.
Wouldn't there be, say, more justification, though, spending the money on, say, old people's homes, or even on Cornell, the point where Captain Cook landed? I believe they want some money there.
Certainly, you can make an argument for that, and you can always make an argument for that, and this is one of the difficulties that governments have in coming to decisions. The government put up some of the proposals I put up to the government were based on that sort of thinking, and we finally decided that we ought to take the step and lift it out of that field and do something, quite separate and distinct. And this is what I think we have done.
What will happen now?
Well, I've agreed to, because of the firm stand taken, a stand taken by the Teachers' Federation, I've agreed to look at alternative arrangements that can be made. In fact, I've got to find alternative arrangement, there's no doubt about this, because they've made it quite clear that if I try to go along with this one, that they'll give consideration to strike, and I'm certainly not prepared to allow a situation to develop where all the children in the Australian Capital Territory, and perhaps extending into New South Wales, could have their teaching jeopardised because of what I consider to be a simply purely local situation.
Is this the first time that this has happened, that Roman Catholic children have gone into a state school as Roman Catholic pupils?
Well, Roman Catholic children are being educated in the state school systems throughout Australia from their own free will and accord. This would have been the first time, as I understand it, that children would have gone in en bloc to use a few empty classrooms, but nevertheless, this is not creating any great precedent in state aid or anything. This was simply a matter of seeking the cooperation of the teachers to overcome a temporary problem.
Of accommodation?
Of accommodation. There are no public halls or anything over there that are suitable for this, but I'll have to find something now.
Do you agree that many people would think that this possibly is a sign of religious bigotry among the teachers?
I certainly would believe that the deputation this morning avoided that issue quite clearly and distinctly. It's not a matter of any bigotry or jealousy in this matter at all. It's a clear and distinct it's a clear distinction between the philosophy of the private sector of education and this government system.
Primary Industry Minister Peter Nixon has rejected a judicial inquiry into Australia's meat exports to the United States.
When horse meat was found substituted for beef in the United States last week, it sent shockwaves through the Australian cattle industry. Today, Primary Industry Minister Peter Nixon met the media in Canberra and explained that he was concerned about a bill, now before Congress, aimed at stopping Australian beef exports to the United States.
Well, regrettably, I'm afraid it'll give a spur to the very powerful meat lobby in Washington. I can only hope that the administration will take Mr Brock's advice, that we are doing our best to resolve the problem, and that they'll take the 15 years good trading into account, and they won't act in a hasty manner.
The future of Primary Industry Minister Peter Nixon has been under discussion by federal cabinet today. Mr Nixon has put his political future in the Prime Minister's hands after coming under fire in the report of the Royal Commission into the meat substitution scandal.
After reading the Royal Commission report, Mr Nixon, in his phrase, put his future in the hands of the Prime Minister. He wasn't saying any more than that before Cabinet met.
I can only confirm that on Friday night I rang the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister offering my resignation.
Even though it's clear that the National Country Party would vehemently oppose the dumping of Mr Nixon, the party leader and Deputy Prime Minister, Mr Anthony, also had little to say publicly.
As I said, I will reserve my judgment. The Prime Minister has made a comment.
A final decision on whether Mr Nixon stays in Cabinet or gets the chop is up to Mr Fraser. The Prime Minister spent the weekend studying the Woodward report and conferring with senior colleagues by phone. His response to questions about Mr Nixon's future was dramatic, but not exactly enlightening.
But I'd like to say in the bluntest possible terms that there are some aspects of that report that make me very, very angry indeed.
The word is, though, that Mr Fraser's anger is not directed at the Minister. So the heavy betting in Canberra is that Mr Nixon will survive, that his resignation offer will be declined. Mr Nixon, after all, is a member of the small inner group of ministers, almost a kitchen cabinet, on whom Mr Fraser relies very heavily. Cabinet would have been painfully aware this afternoon that if Mr Nixon were to go, it might prove to be a near-fatal blow to a government already badly battered by shocks and scandals and weakened by resignations. The Woodward report, I understand, contains a fair amount of praise for Mr Nixon and only one critical section. That fact and Mr Fraser's anger at the evidence on which the criticism is based is likely to save his ministerial career. Laurie Oakes, Eyewitness News, Canberra.
The pilots made no secret of their concern for the future of the airport, which they feel could be taken over by commercial airlines. However, the Federal Minister for Transport, Mr Nixon, was non-committal about the future of Bankstown, saying he would wait for the outcome of the study of Sydney's major airport needs. Later, Mr Nixon was asked about a reported incident in which 3 aircraft were involved in a near miss near Brisbane last Tuesday.
There'll be automatically an investigation made of these. The procedures of the department are such that immediately an occasion like this is notified, there is an investigation and a report will come to the department and to me.
Who do you blame, Mr Nixon, air traffic controllers?
Well, I'm not prepared to blame anybody on these sorts of incidents until I get a report. The one in Sydney, following the one in Sydney, there were 2 air traffic controllers stood down. Now, until I get a report, I'm not prepared to make a judgment.
Are you satisfied that the air is safe enough for commercial travellers?
Australia still has the safest aviation in the world. The levels of expenditure and the manning are such to maintain that. I've said all along since coming back into government, I will not allow government cutbacks to prejudice in any way air safety.
There has been a report this morning that there have been actually more near misses than have been reported. Is that a fact?
Well, I don't know whether that's a fact or not, but all near misses, it's up to the pilots or the air traffic controllers or those in the air to report such an incident.
It's been suggested the department's been covering them up.
The department can't cover them up. There are automatic procedures, and it's a nonsense to say that the department is covering them up. If there is a report of a separation problem, there is an automatic investigation.
While airfares are coming down all over the world, they still remain high in Australia. In fact, the international airfare structure has become a farce. For instance, it's possible to fly from Southeast Asia to London for much less than it costs to fly to Southeast Asia.
The reason that there's been yet no action seen is because once the government takes its prime decisions, we've got to get into negotiation with other governments around the world. And that's why I've been saying to the Australian people, we are determined to get a regime of cheaper airfares. It's got to be an orderly, regular system of cheaper airfares, a non-discriminatory system that every Australian can share in, and that takes some doing.
Thai International, flight 982 to London.
The jet set has given way to the jet age stampede. No politician can afford not to consider the clamour for cheaper airfares. Aviation writer of the Bulletin, John Stackhouse.
Facing Mr Nixon at the moment.
Mr Nixon's got the problem that while he's trying to appease the political element in Australia, and more than a million Australians are travelling overseas every year, and consequently there are a whole lot of vote casters among them, he's got to live with the effect that this is going to have in Southeast Asia and among the European airlines.
How much is Qantas being looked after?
It has been Qantas above all. If you look at the history of price fares in this country, that has led all the initiatives ever taken of any consequence in lower airfares down over the last 15, 20 years.
All right, Minister, if it's taken all the initiatives, how is it that you can fly from Kuala Lumpur to London for $290 and from Sydney to London it's going to cost you about $800?
Well, you see, the reason simply, the two reasons, that airline operates on a basis of a totally full aircraft, and they don't fly unless they want to, whereas Qantas have got a schedule. They've got to leave tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. and they leave whether they've got one passenger or a full plane, because as a government we demand that Qantas provide scheduled services for the Australian travelling people.
Mr Nixon has an enormous problem on his plate. Whatever he decides to do, he's going to offend someone, and being a politician, he'll probably settle for not offending the voters.
Within half an hour of the announcement of the new fares by Mr Nixon in Canberra this morning, the signs were going up outside the head offices of Qantas and British Airways in Sydney. The airlines were already taking bookings. The public relations manager of British Airways in Sydney, Mr Richard Baker, said that already people were queuing up to book for the cheap flights. So far, there's been no official comment on the new fares by the airlines of the other countries, which will undoubtedly be affected. Negotiations are still going on between Australia and Asian countries, and the Asian airlines say that any comment will have to come from government level. In the meantime, the chairman of Qantas, Sir Lennox Hewitt, remains unperturbed. Is this new agreement what Qantas was seeking?
Absolutely. Lower fares, the lowest possible fares, the greatest number of travellers.
So you're quite confident that the new low fare is going to be a success?
Oh, I am absolutely certain. It's exhilarating news and a wonderful Christmas present.
What effect do you think it's going to have on Qantas's profitability?
We'll do as well as we've done in the past.
It has been mentioned that as a result of the two-way agreement between the UK and Australia that Qantas might lose out on landing rights in some Southeast Asian countries. Are you concerned about that, or do you think it's likely?
These are matters that will be discussed between the governments. I don't think it's likely, no.
How do you think people are going to find flying non-stop between Sydney and London?
They've been doing it for years and enjoying it.
The Dairy Corporation called it a significant event. Australian cheddar was going to Britain for the first time in 8 years. So, Primary Industry Minister Peter Nixon was there to say cheese, as the cameras clicked.
In the heart of Siberia, across thousands of miles of forest and permafrost, the Russians are laying new tracks.
Loaded onto high-speed intercontinental goods trains, and this would of course have an absolutely devastating effect on the European Oriental shipping runs.
The world's cargo routes have for years been in the hands of international shipping conferences. The services they offer are efficient, regular and priced at set conference rates. The shipping conferences have been putting pressure on Western governments around the world to try and keep the Russians in check. A lot of pressure has been put on Transport Minister Peter Nixon.
I've told the shipping nations of Europe, and I've told the shipping interests of Europe when they've come into this office, that they shouldn't look to Australia to lead the way in this, that if they're concerned about the growth of Russian shipping, they ought to take the initiative, they ought to get legislation on their books first. They ought to be the prime starter, that we can support them if we're concerned about our export trades. So I don't have to take as hard a line on this as I do on many other issues.
Certainly, the established shipping world is in for some stiff competition, and it's competition from a nation that doesn't base its economy on making a profit. The Russians may not be very efficient at the moment, But all that will change in the future. And besides, the copyright on Rule Britannia has long since run out, and it's up for grabs. In the light of that, the Minister for Transport, Peter Nixon, is considering some new legislation.
It is probable that I will introduce some countervailing legislation following a review we've made about overseas cargo shipping legislation in the autumn session of Parliament.
What sort of legislation would that be?
Well, legislation similar to that recommended by the EEC Commission, who have drawn attention, and I use their words, they're not my words, to the aggressive non-commercial behaviour of the shipping lines of certain state trading countries, particularly the Soviet Union, and they've recommended to their members that each country ought to have some legislation on its books to act. Now, it may well be that I will be recommending to the government that we'll put down some form of legislation, not particularly against Soviet shipping, but state-owned shipping in general terms, so that should the need arise, I haven't got to call Parliament together or something else to get legislation in, but we'll have it on the books. And it would be similar to the British legislation or legislation already passed by a number of the European parliaments.
Mr Nixon, this scheme seems pretty watertight. How confident are you that the unions will accept it?
Well, the unions will accept the scheme if they want shipbuilding of this magnitude in Australia. If they want ships to be built over 15,000 tonnes or of that size, they'll accept it.
And if they don't, that's the end of their jobs?
It's certainly the end of their jobs. They've got to recognise that the taxpayer is putting a great contribution into the building of ships in this country, some $13,000 per man employed. And if the taxpayer is going to pay that price for shipbuilding, there needs to be a contract between the unions on strikes, on go-slows and demarcations and the like, so that the people of Australia can see that their money is well invested.
Nevertheless, this contract seems pretty stiff in industrial relations terms.
It would be a breakthrough, I think, in industrial relations terms in this country, but I think it's worth that. The high cost of shipbuilding demands something special, and if we're going to maintain it, if we're going to keep building ships of this size in Australia, then the men themselves have got to make a contribution towards that.
And if the men break the contract, what happens?
If the men break the contract, there will be a penalty.
What sort of a penalty?
A financial penalty that the New South Wales government will take care of, and it'll all be part of the contract.
And will it be a severe one?
Well, they've got to keep the ship to the cost of as it's laid down in the contract, and if industrial trouble increases the cost, that's got to be paid for by New South Wales. New South Wales has got to worry about the collection of payment for that.
If the men accept this contract, when could work start on the two ANL ships?
Work could start immediately.
Mr Nixon, is there any possibility of negotiations being reopened, perhaps with the intervention of Mr Hawke?
No, there's no chance of the negotiations being reopened. We've been dealing with Mr Rand on this matter. He's the owner of the dockyard, he's the Premier of New South Wales, and there's been correspondence flowing backwards and forwards between he and the Prime Minister. Now, the final letter has gone to Mr Rand this morning informing him that our offer now lapses because he, Mr Rand, has failed to successfully negotiate the heads of agreement that we laid down some weeks ago.
But why couldn't Mr Hawke intervene?
Well, Mr Hawke can intervene with Mr Rand if he likes. I mean, if the heads of agreement were to be agreed to between the unions and the Premier of New South Wales as owner of the state dockyard, and the ACTU had to be involved, then it was Mr Rand's responsibility to call Mr Hawke into him and talk there at that level and negotiate it there and then come back to us with a concluded agreement. But Mr Rand failed even to recognise his own responsibility, and as recently as yesterday or this week was trying to say he didn't carry the responsibility even for that, although the early correspondence showed that he accepted responsibility for the negotiation. I'm afraid Mr Hawke and I did discuss this matter some weeks ago, and Mr Hawke accepted that it was Mr Rand's responsibility to negotiate the heads of agreement.
So what happens now to the men at Newcastle when work runs out?
When work runs out, my colleague, the Minister of Employment and Industrial Relations, will be in touch with the New South Wales Government about redeployment of the men and trying to assist them in finding other jobs.
So you do see some federal responsibility for them?
Oh, absolutely. We've never run away from that. There's no question about that, and we'll be doing our share to help. No question about that. But the fact is that large shipbuilding in Newcastle after many, many years, will cease.
What's the possibility of the federal government making an offer now to the South Australian government, a similar offer for Whyalla?
Well, I would think BHP would be making their own decisions following failure of the New South Wales government to negotiate this heads of agreement, which would have lifted the subsidy rate for large shipbuilding in Australia. Because we will now not be lifting the subsidy rate for large shipbuilding, I would think that BHP would take that into account and make their own commercial decision.
So you're not prepared to offer an expanded subsidy rate to Whyalla?
No, we haven't been involved in discussions with BHP on this particular question. The question is really resolved around the Newcastle question. If Newcastle was settled satisfactorily, I have no doubt then the Whyalla one would have been also. But Whyalla will have the Whyalla question is a matter now for BHP.
But if BHP were to request the increased subsidy, would you consider it?
Well, we would only consider it on the same sort of basis that we were requesting it at Newcastle. That is, a no-strike clause and a heads of agreement of similar nature.
Mr Nixon, how far would you see the Commonwealth's offer going towards alleviating unemployment in the area caused by the decision to close down sand mining?
Well, I think the allocation of $10 million will more than substantially overcome any difficulties of redeployment, because it will lead to the investment of some fairly large sums of money in capital works programs as well. And hopefully, after my discussions with Mr Jalkey-Peterson, the Premier of Queensland, on this matter, we'll have a program of works that will totally employ all those people presently engaged in sand mining in Maryborough.
Is it a negotiable offer?
Oh yes, quite negotiable. I'm open to consideration. In fact, I'm hoping that we'll be able to set up some joint Commonwealth State committee to work through a program of projects that might be undertaken.
You've talked also about compensatory payments to the mining companies themselves and people who had contracts with them. How high would you see those going?
Well, I don't want to go into the details of that at the moment, other than to say that it'll be a fairly substantial sum of money in total, and the purpose of that is, of course, so that those people having been put out of work because of the closing down of a viable industry, and that's what it was, by a government decision, then they will be compensated for it. And the first line contractors and the mining companies both will be compensated.
You say substantial, tens of millions, hundreds of millions?
No, nothing like that. No, just a few $1 million to take up the slack between this and the end of their contract, which runs out at the end of 1977, as I understand it. So all in all, I think it's a very significant decision the government has taken, because we are taking a decision to compensate both the district and the people employed by redeployment purposes and direct financial compensation because of the closing down of a viable industry.
You said in your statement that it shouldn't be seen as a precedent.
Well, it can't be seen as a precedent because hopefully we won't get into this position again. Hopefully all environmental impact studies will be done before mining companies commence, and therefore we should not get into this position again. It won't be a precedent, say, compared with the shipbuilding industry, for example, which is apparently closing down now as a result of the union's failure to accept the heads of agreement we put to them. In that case, they refused to help themselves. In this case, the government took a conscious decision to close down a viable industry, and that's why it should not be seen as a precedent in other areas of government activity.
Closed gates and deserted buildings. This meatworks at Oakley in Victoria is one of a score throughout the country to have closed down recently. As well as the closures, many meatworks are operating at only 40% of their capacity. Some have declared multi-million-dollar losses, and thousands of meat workers have been stood down. An alarming situation in any industry, but when it occurs in one which pays $50 million a week to producers, is worth $1,500 million in exports and almost as much on the domestic market, there's obviously cause for concern.
We have something of the order of some 45,000 people. It's one of the largest employers of people. It's a very labour-intensified industry. And everyone's worried about unemployment, and yet here is an industry being dismantled by the government.
The problem is that there are too many abattoirs for the amount of stock available, a problem that stems from the 50s and 60s when meatworks were expanded and opened up throughout the country to meet the needs of a booming industry. One attitude is that the industry has become fat and lazy.
They sought relief from the
levy, collection of the levy, the $3 per head, that meets the Meat Inspection Services cost. They sought removal of payroll tax, which is a state matter, and they sought a transfer back to the industry of the levy on tuberculosis and brucellosis. And I don't think it's appropriate to open that question at the moment. So on those 3 points, the answer is no.
Not very encouraging words for the thousands of unemployed meat workers such as these throughout the country. The latest indication from the industry's barometer, the stock market, is that the situation for meatworks is about to worsen. The past 5 years, more than 20 million sheep have been shipped out of the country, mainly to the Middle East. In 1972, the industry slaughtered nearly 50 million sheep. This year it'll be looking at 30 million if it's lucky. Despite this, exports are expected to continue at the rate of 6 million a year for the next 5 years.
The live sheep industry has decimated the sheep killing industry in Australia, and nobody can deny that. It has lost a lot of work, it's got a lot of capital investment at risk. There is millions and millions of dollars of equipment laying idle because the sheep are not being killed in Australia.
It's an issue described by the former leader of the ACTU, Bob Hawke, as potentially the most divisive in the country. Initially, in confrontations at Portland in Victoria, the union used pickets and fought police to get the message home. Now there's only a token picket line, but the main weapon in future will be strikes.
The meat industry has always been racked with industrial problems, and the industrial difficulties have on earlier occasions almost brought the industry to its knees. And I think the combination of that long-term running sore and now the present difficulty of shortage of cattle has brought the industry to the present crisis.
Now, anyone within a shade of honesty at all must say that a strike does have an effect on an employer's profit. As to how much it has on its viability, of course, is another question. But this union has bothered to correct some statements made by people, and it's convenient for chairmen of boards of directors, particularly public companies, to blame mismanagement and the loss of a profit or a loss of a dividend on strikes. Now, I can show facts to a lot of people that indeed in 1980 and 79 that a number of strikes saved employers a lot of money because they were not getting the throughput, they had too many men on the plants and a whole number of reasons.
The promotional message of Meat Week is that red meat is an essential, nutritious and economic part of the family diet, and that was enough to entice many a politician out of Parliament House and across the road to celebrate the event, along with its organisers, the Australian Meat and Livestock Corporation. The wafting smells of an Aussie barbie were also a little too much for a nearby hunger striker who's been campaigning to get his wife and children out of Hungary. Turning the first steak, the Primary Industry Minister, Peter Nixon, launched National Meat Week, explaining later he was something of a specialist when it came to red meat.
I should be. I've been involved in a fair bit of controversy about red meat in the last 12 or 18 months, so I've made myself somewhat of a specialist. I can tell the difference between good kangaroo and bad kangaroo, good horse and bad horse meat, and the best of all beefs.
Annual consumption of red meat has fallen from a high of 90 kilograms per person to around 70. The Meat Week campaign, with barbecues and promotions in each state, aims to regain some of the ground lost to the chicken and quiche eaters of this country. Jeff Powell, Canberra.
It's hard to believe that these bags contain a substance which has been the subject of government inquiries and a lot of lobbying in Canberra recently. Mr Nixon has promised a review of the export controls when the effects of the last drought are fully understood. After all, his government's philosophy is free trade.
Philosophically, I believe they should have freedom to export, and indeed they do have right to export now. They get approval from me when there is surplus meat meal about. But I'm not prepared to lift those controls whilst there's a downturn in the volume of production of meat meal. Our total cattle and sheep numbers are down. The throughput of abattoirs is down. The volume of meat meal to be produced will be down. Now, I've told the industry that I will watch that circumstance and make another judgment on this when I believe it desirable.
The first people that are rejected are the small family butchers. They wouldn't reject the large abattoirs because their contracts are too important. And so that sort of discrimination should be taken into account by the government also.
The producers of meat meals still have the right to export, and indeed do export. They come to me and they get approval to export time after time after time. I don't think they've been refused. So I don't believe there's any real hardship for them at the moment, and I believe it is desirable to protect the consuming industries at the moment.
The one thing that I have concluded out of Mr. Whitlam's visit to China is that his visit to China was one thing, but the neighbouring countries in the region around Australia are somewhat disappointed that in his talks with Chow En-lai he should have used such undiplomatic expressions that he used, well, talking about the Philippines and Thailand, insinuating into the good graces. You know, it's not described as being the most diplomatic language, and talked about in terms of the Japanese, that Australians had a great fear of Japan's reviving militarism. Now, one doesn't say these things in public. You know, it's not good diplomacy, to say the least. And the second thing is, I think what's concerning many of the nations, if he's prepared to go that far in public, what's his thoughts in private? So the truth is that Mr. Whitlam is seen, so far as the countries in the surrounding region is concerned, Mr. Whitlam is seen as a very big man with some lost face.
Which of these countries would you say was particularly critical of him?
Well, they're most of them far too polite in diplomatic terms to be too critical, and most of them would not follow the line that Mr. Whitlam himself followed. And in fact, in Japan, Mr. Whitlam was received very well. But nevertheless, the Japanese, as I understand it, are quite hurt that he should have bruited their country around in such a fashion.
Going overseas. From today, you'll be able to take a tasty little bit of Australia with you. Australia's first primary produce shop, selling everything from lobster tails to honeycomb, was officially opened at Sydney Airport today by the Minister for Primary Industry, Mr. Nixon, and the Minister for Transport, Mr. Hunt. The shop is the result of an idea from the chairman of Qantas, Sir Lennox Hewitt. He thought it up about 2 years ago, but it's taken since then for all the various government departments and produce boards to agree to it. But now it's open for business, perhaps a little smaller than Sir Lennox envisaged. Maybe what it needs is a good ochre salesman to bring in the customers.
Minister for Shipping and Transport, Peter Nixon.
The reason the line has bought the big ships overseas is because on the occasions they've been offered to the Australian shipbuilding industry, there has been some reason why they've not been interested. They've been busy at the time and couldn't meet the time schedule that was required of them, or there have been technical developments in the new ship that would make it far too costly in an Australian yard. And recognise there are only 4 or 5 ships that we've got that have been built overseas.
Isn't it really a case that if Australian yards could apply the subsidy for export vessels, they could in fact build these ships competitively?
It could be, but this raises another question entirely. The question of subsidy brings into account the OECD regulations that apply to shipbuilding industry, and Australia is not a banana republic after all. We are recognised as a fairly stable nation that does tend to follow the international rules. And in this regard, one of the OECD rules is that there shall not be subsidy for ships on the export trade, and we're just simply following that rule in that regard.
The bitterest complaint from the shipbuilders is the presence of what they call foreign ships on the Australian coast. These are the 41 ships that were imported for coastal use on condition they'd be replaced when a locally built ship was possible.
Mr. Nixon, what sites are being looked at for Omega?
Well, there are a number of sites being looked at in Victoria, in the northern parts of Victoria, the Riverina, and I announced, or I informed the shires in Gippsland yesterday, 5 shires in Gippsland, that we're extending the number of sites because the advice I've got is that the further south and the further east we go on the mainland, the better the prospect the site may be. So we've now included the shires of Alberton, Bairnsdale, Rosedale, Tambo and Orbost in a selection.
Well, when will a decision be made?
Well, the final decision will be made on a site when all the tests that have got to be taken are made. That is, soil conductivity, availability of facilities, lack of interference from air flights and other things of that nature. It's a 1,200-foot tower that's got to be built, therefore it's got to be sited fairly selectively.
Well, who'll make the final decision?
Well, I suppose I will, but it'll be a technical judgment. I won't be making any political decision on the matter. It'll be my decision will be based on the technical advice I get from the department.
There's been some suggestion that unions will try and stop the thing from being built. If this happens, what will you do about it?
Well, let's wait and see what happens. The facts are that the Parliament has had an investigation made of this navigation aid and brought down a report that's in favour of it. I don't understand what the unions are on about, but let's wait and see.
Looking at your trip to Japan, what was the most significant thing to come out of that?
The most significant thing that came out of it was the concern that the Japanese have got about the industrial situation in Australia as it affects the relationship with Japan, as it affects our reputation as a stable supplier, and even as it affects jobs of other Australian citizens. And this flowed out of every meeting I had, and I met, I suppose, 40 or 50 of the top people in Japan, government and business, shipping, banking, the whole lot. And I was so concerned about it at the end of the week that on Friday I sent a telegram to Bob Hawke on the question, because he is going to Japan today. When I got to Hong Kong on Friday night, I rang him and I spoke to him for half an hour on the situation so that he is fully briefed about the concern as it's been expressed to me.
Well, industrial unrest in Australia has caused what problems for the Japanese?
It's caused the problem, for example, I'll give you one instance, it's caused the problem of them being forced to stockpile a lot more of the commodities than they really would want to and have room to do so. And this, of course, has done a great expense to them and a great inconvenience. But worse still, they're nervous of running out of the commodity when industrial difficulty can tie up ships, for example, that, for a long time. And they are looking, obviously, at alternate supplies in some areas because of this matter. Well, I don't want to make any comment at all about the Russians' reaction. It would be quite improper for me to do so until I've talked to the Prime Minister. The matter did come up, of course. All I can say is that I was the guest of the Russian government. Their reception of me was as warm and cordial as one could ever wish, and they're looking forward to the visit of Doug Anthony in a few days' time. And there's no doubt at all that the Russians are keen to have warm relations with Australia.
The Minister for Primary Industry, Mr. Peter Nixon, was to have officially opened trading but was unable to because of a plane delay. He arrived at the exchange only minutes after Mr. Oliver had sounded the bell to start trading. The Minister said the contracts would bring a new offering to exporters and traders in the cattle market, and that he was sure those involved would make the most of it. In Sydney, this is Kate Brophy.
To forever scotch this nonsense, I say clearly and unequivocally that there is not now, nor has there been since his election, any challenge to Mr. Anthony's leadership. And I suggest publicly to those so-called commentators and inspired rumour mongers who bruit this nonsense abroad that instead of listening to corridor gossip, they might have referred their questions to me, the national president of the party.
They know that their only chance of getting their way is through some default on the part of government. Their only hope now, and I believe for a long time to come, is to capitalise on any division which might occur or which can be generated within coalition. Their only hope lies in our weakness, division, disharmony within coalition. We would be foolish, Mr. President, to ignore the fact that there are, historically, some areas of difference between the Liberal Party and our own party in some states and in some local situations. Skirmishes will always have to be contended with at grassroots levels. These differences become apparent from time to time, as we are seeing evident in some states at the moment. But whatever might happen in these states and in local situations, there is one thing that I am utterly determined, and that is that these attitudes will not under any circumstances flow through to the federal level.
I name this ship Australia Star. May God bless her and all who sail in her.
Well, the building of the Australia Star is important to Australia because the trade between Australia and the Middle East that this ship is going to service, we think is one of the best prospective trades for Australian meats and other Australian products. And the Blue Star Line, in putting the ship into this particular trade, I think will do a lot for further development of trading opportunities between Australia and the Middle East.
I've made my point. I think the appropriate course for you to follow now is to ask Mr. Whitlam.
Well, why did you raise that question?
Whatever the Prime Minister knows, I've got no idea. I haven't spoken to him.
You say you're not in the business of character assassination, and yet surely these questions could be interpreted as slur by innuendo.
I think there's... if Mr. Whitlam can satisfactorily answer these questions, then of course I stand by it. I'm the one that will suffer. But I suggest you ask Mr. Whitlam.
Surely you're adding further speculation to the situation at the moment.
What I am doing, I think, is putting in proper perspective the sorts of charges and allegations that Mr. Whitlam has been making about my colleagues over the past couple of weeks, where he has tried to bury the real issues of this campaign by an absolutely immoral attack on the integrity of my colleagues. I'm not prepared to stand by and see that occur without Mr. Whitlam without the people of Australia knowing all about Mr. Whitlam.
Mr. Nixon, what are the prospects, if any, of Concorde flying to Australia?
I think there's no chance of seeing Concorde now for some years, and that's been confirmed this morning with my discussions with British Airways.
Why is that?
Simply because the market is not big enough, in their view. The people that will use Concorde out of Singapore can come from Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane and Sydney as well as Melbourne, whereas if it's stationed in Melbourne, they've got to try and draw those passengers down to Melbourne before flying on their way through Singapore to London.
Has there been any evidence of a strong enough demand to warrant the use of Concorde from Australia?
I understand that Concorde is drawing passengers out of Australia now in Singapore, and they want to measure the number of passengers travelling that way before they even think about committing to Melbourne.
What about the existing agreement between Qantas and BA and the new cheap fare structure? How's that operating?
Well, I'm delighted to say that in Britain I've found great support for the new regime. They consider it to be thoroughly successful, and that confirms my own view about the Australian end of it.
One of the views put forward is that because there are such large numbers of Australians travelling, there could be more services. Is that a possibility?
One of the conditions under which the scheme has been put into operation is that the carriers must carry the traffic. And in general terms, I think they've been meeting the demands that have been placed on them, and they will continue to do so.
What about Sir Freddie Laker? What prospects has he got of getting into Australia, and has he been discussed on this tour?
Yes, I've had discussions about the Laker question. Again, I've said again, as I've said in Australia, that after this scheme is in place, after the ASEAN question is settled, after everything else is, and we've got some experience of the whole of the scheme in place, we'll then look at the Laker question and, of course, look at the prospect of an Australian charter operator as well.
When do you think that might be?
Towards the end of 1980. In fact, under Ian Sinclair's time as Minister, there's been a complete reversal of the situation that faced primary industry when we came into government. The wool industry, the beef industry, the dairy industry, the grains industry has been solid right through. The sugar industry has been in difficulties or potential difficulties, and has been Ian Sinclair at the centre of restructuring and re-establishing the primacy of these industries. And I think he ought to be congratulated for the work he's done. And I think, with hindsight, people will see that. I don't propose to be a caretaker minister, Ian. I propose to be active in the portfolio. Ian Sinclair would want me to be active for a start, and already I think I've demonstrated that I don't propose to sit back and be non-active.
What are the most critical issues that you think you'll face over the coming months?
Well, difficult to tell. There are plenty of issues facing me right now, right today.
What are those?
Well, wheat industry, the question of whether or not there's going to be a ceiling price for industrial and stock feed wheat, the question of the barrier reef and the fishing of marlin and the Japanese fisheries agreement, the situation in the dairy industry with Asian dairies, the appointment of chairman of the dairy industry, and look, there's 1,000 of them.
How do you react to the criticism that whilst you occupy both the portfolios of primary industry and transport, that when it comes to issues like freight rate negotiations, you inevitably face a conflict of interest because of the concern the government must also have in the maintenance of a profitable shipping line, national shipping line?
Look, that's a hoary old one. The question of the maintenance of a profitable shipping line has nothing to do with the government's approach to these matters. The fact is that ANL happens to be a government shipping line because we wanted a window in the conference system. And that's been of enormous benefit to the Australian economy and to Australian industry. In fact, one can't place a value on that benefit. It is so enormous. But having said that, I don't go looking at freight rate negotiations and measure those against the possible profit or loss of ANL. I don't even consider the question of profit or loss of ANL when I'm looking at those negotiations. All I consider is the effect of those negotiations on the industry concerned, and that's been the line I've taken and the attitude I've taken right through as Minister for Transport. And mark you, I've had to approve freight rate negotiations as Minister for Transport in the past, and I don't think I've had one complaint from any of the commodity boards or exporters about my approach to it.
Mr. Killen, is there anything you would like to say to viewers on this, the last edition of This Day Tonight?
Frankly, no.
Well, it's well known, I think, that I'm supposed to have some prejudices about the ABC and even TDT, but I'd like to assure the viewers I had nothing to do with the death and even less to do with the funeral.
You had your fare. That's been very satisfying to the viewer.
Farewell to the tragic comedies from 7:30 to 8.